Imagine a life stripped bare of everything we associate with civilization. No art, no letters, no society. Just perpetual fear and the ever-present danger of violent death. In that state, the life of man is, as he famously put it, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's Thomas Hobbes's chilling vision of what happens when government collapses or, well, never exists in the first place. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a deep dive into one of the most monumental and, let's be honest, controversial works of political philosophy ever written, Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan.
And this deep dive, it's specifically tailored to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight from the sources you've shared with us on this foundational text. Hobbes provides a powerful, really systematic argument for the necessity of government, starting from a view of human nature that, many find deeply unsettling.
Our mission is to follow Hobbes's logic as it unfolds in Leviathan. We'll begin by understanding the turbulent world that shaped his thinking, then delve into his stark depiction of human nature, explore the terrifying state he believed awaited us without a common power, uncover his solution in the form of a social contract, and finally grapple with his controversial defense of an absolute undivided sovereign. It's a progression designed to show you why, for Hobbes, order is really the highest political good.
Yeah, absolutely. And to truly grasp Leviathan, you absolutely must understand the historical crucible, the context in which Hobbes forged his ideas. The sources make it abundantly clear that his life was lived through a period defined by extreme violence and profound political instability.
And the sources point directly to the English Civil War as having a profound impact on his philosophy. This wasn't just background noise, was it? It was, according to one source, culpable for the asperity of his later language and thinking. He actually associated the chaotic state of nature directly with an event that, well, no one living through it could question the factual basis of our present Civil War.
That connection is absolutely crucial. Hobbes wasn't just theorizing about some hypothetical past. He saw civil war as the state of nature manifesting in real time within a society that had previously known peace. The sources highlight this conceptual symbiosis between the state of nature and civil war. His own experience reinforced this. The sources note his hesitancy to return to England, which was riven by civil discord, precisely because there wasn't enough security that would have encouraged him to abandon his exile.
Right.
For him, there was simply no peace for the laws of nature to be safely observed. The chaos wasn't just abstract, it was a personal, immediate threat.
Okay, so if that's the backdrop Civil War, personal insecurity, a society tearing itself apart, what is the fundamental problem Hobbes is trying to solve with this massive work, Leviathan?
The sources are very clear on this. The central problem is the problem of civil war and the preservation of peace. His entire philosophical project is, it's a carefully constructed argument aimed at demonstrating, with almost mathematical rigor, the necessity of absolute sovereign power in the Commonwealth.
Absolute power being the key.
Yes. For him, this absolute power is the only reliable bulwark against a return to the horrors he witnessed. One source puts it starkly. Hobbes frequently stipulated there was no alternative condition for a once peaceful commonwealth that had experienced a division of sovereign authority to be reduced, but civil war and the state of nature. Division of power, in his view, leads inevitably, disastrously, back to the state of nature.
And the title Leviathan. That evokes the biblical sea monster, a creature of immense terrifying power. What's that symbolizing in his philosophy?
Well, the sources don't give a super deep dive into the title's specific symbolism, but the context heavily implies it represents the sovereign state itself. Hobbes argues for a common power to keep them all in awe.
Keep them in awe.
Exactly. The Leviathan, this overwhelming entity, symbolizes the artificial person of the Commonwealth, the sovereign state, necessary to control the inherently chaotic tendencies of human beings and prevent the war of all against all. It's a deliberate choice of a powerful, maybe even fearsome image to convey the scale and strength of the power he believes is required to maintain order. One source even mentions the catching of Leviathan in its title, suggesting this immense power is something to be understood and contained, but implicitly acknowledging its formidable nature.
So the chaotic times he lived through really hammered home the absolute need for order. But his argument for the necessary state doesn't start with the state itself. It drills right down to the individual. What is Hobbes's view of human nature? How does he see us, at our core?
His view, as the sources detail, is fundamentally materialist and mechanistic. He saw human beings much like, complex machines. Sense perception, for instance, is described as nothing but fancy that is caused by the pressure, That is, by the motion of external things on our eyes, ears, and other organs.
Just physical motion causing sensation.
Pretty much. Even imagination, including dreams, is simply the decaying residue of those prior sensations. It's a very physical, almost clinical way of understanding the mind.
And this aligns with the scientific thinking of his era, doesn't it? The sources connect his materialism to the new natural philosophy of his day, even mentioning Harvey's work on the circulation of blood as an influence on his philosophy of mind and his views on human psychology and physiology. He's trying to apply a scientific lens to politics and human behavior.
Exactly right. He's building his political theory on what he sees as a realistic, scientific understanding of human beings. And this mechanistic view leads to a key conclusion. He did not believe humans to be either innately moral or innately rational creatures.
So not naturally good or logical.
Not in the sophisticated sense needed for society, no. Morality and complex rationality are not natural endowments. They are, as the courses put it regarding reason, achieved through work, through the process of language, calculation, and, logic. They have to be developed.
Okay, so if we're not naturally moral or rational in that complex way, what does drive us? What are our fundamental motivations, according to Hobbes?
Passions and appetites. The sources explicitly list humanity's basic qualities as things like pride, avarice, ambition, and fear of death, and underpinning it all, he asserts that humans are fundamentally self-interested.
Fundamentally self-interested.
Yes. Every voluntary act, the sources quote him saying, has some good to himself as its object. We are basically wired to pursue our own preservation and satisfaction.
That phrase, the object is some good to himself, that's pivotal, isn't it? It means even actions that look altruistic can ultimately be traced back to some personal motivation, like maybe the pleasure of being approved of or avoiding guilt.
Precisely. And this relentless pursuit of good to himself, coupled with the fact that desires in this life can never be fully satisfied, leads to his most famous psychological observation. The perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceaseth only in death.
Wow. That sounds incredibly cynical. Like everyone just wants to dominate others.
Well, it sounds that way, but it's crucial to understand Hobbes' definition of power here, as the sources remind us. He doesn't just mean political tyranny or domination. Power, for Hobbes, is the means to satisfy future desires.
Okay, the means.
Yes. Because you can never be absolutely certain about securing what you have or achieving what you want in the future, the drive to acquire more power, more means, is essentially endless, stopping only when life itself does. Life itself is but motion, he says, and can never be without desire. To secure your life and satisfy these ongoing desires, you need power, and the uncertainty of the future compels this constant seeking of more.
This connects to that idea of global maximizers mentioned in the sources, right?
Yeah, right. Hobbes assumes that humans, in their self-preservation drive, aren't simply focused on the immediate moment, what they call local maximizers. They are capable of reasoning about the long-term, global maximizers.
Thinking ahead.
Exactly. This means they are willing, theoretically, to place their lives in jeopardy in the short run by, for example, risking conflict or giving up certain liberties for the sake of gaining greater security of life in the long run. This capacity for long-term calculation is absolutely essential for understanding why they would ever choose to leave the state of nature.
Okay, so we're self-interested, driven by passions, constantly seeking power as a means to security and satisfaction. But out of all those motivations, pride, avarice, ambition, fear, which one is the most potent force pushing us towards some kind of collective solution?
It's overwhelmingly fear, particularly the fear of death. The sources really highlight this as the primary motivator for escaping the state of nature. Fear of violent death and of wounds, they note, disposes men to obey a common power. While other passions might spark conflict, it's that deep, persistent fear of violent death that provides the rational basis for seeking peace and order.
The sources also mention another kind of fear, a perpetual fear in mankind due to ignorance of causes. This leads people to attribute events to some invisible power or agent when they can't find a natural explanation.
Yes, and this touches on his later points about religion and superstition. This inherent human tendency to seek causes, combined with fear and uncertainty, can lead people to attributing power to unseen forces. And if these claims of invisible power aren't guided by reason, and, crucially, subordinate to the civil authority, they can become a major source of division and conflict, which Hobbes saw as a huge threat to civil peace.
So Hobbes paints this picture of humans as fundamentally self-interested, sort of mechanistic beings, driven by passions, especially the fear of death, and seeking power relentlessly as a means to security. What happens then when you take these individuals and place them in a condition with no common authority, no government to restrain them? This is where we get Hobbes's famous concept of the state of nature.
The state of nature, for Hobbes, is that hypothetical condition of humanity living without a common power to keep them all in awe. It's not necessarily a historical claim about how humanity began, although he did point to some contemporary examples he thought fit. Its primary function is as a thought experiment, basically. Strip away government, and this is what you're left with.
And the sources address this point about its historical reality. They note that detractors question whether it had existed.
Yes, but the sources emphasize that for Hobbes, the conceptual link to the English Civil War was his undeniable evidence. He saw the manner of life, which men have formerly lived under a peaceful government, used to degenerate into in a civil war.
Wow.
Civil war was the state of nature erupting within an existing commonwealth.
So it wasn't just ancient history for him.
Not at all. He did refer to places like many places of America as maybe contemporary examples where indigenous peoples might not have had a centralized sovereign in the European sense, but the lived, raw experience of the Civil War was the most potent and persuasive evidence for him and his readers.
And in this state, why is it a war of every man against every man? That sounds exhausting.
It is, and as the sources clarify, war consists not in battle only or the act of fighting, but in a tract of time wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known. It's the condition where conflict is always imminent, like foul weather, an inclination thereto of many days together. You live in constant anticipation and readiness for violence.
And why is this state of perpetual or imminent war just inevitable in the absence of a common power?
Several factors, really, all stemming from his view of human nature and the lack of external restraint. First, there's the fundamental conflict of interests. In the state of nature, there's no objective standard of right or wrong, good or evil. The sources note that each individual called good that which pleased him or her at the moment.
My good might be your bad.
Exactly. With competing desires and no shared measure of justice, conflicts over resources, perceived slights, or just grabbing for future power are pretty much unavoidable. Secondly, the sources mention individuals provoking one another through words and other signs of contempt and hatred, which are incident to all comparison. Our pride and vanity make us incredibly sensitive to how we stack up against others, leading to conflict based on perceived disrespect or rivalry.
And there's also the problem of trust, right, or the lack of it.
Absolutely. This links to the fallacious reasoning, specifically short-sightedness, discussed in the sources. Even if individuals could see the benefit of cooperation, they might prioritize immediate gains over long-term agreements. And crucially, even if you are a good calculator of your long-term self-interest and see the benefit of peace, you can never be sure that others aren't short-sighted or that they don't fear you are short-sighted.
That mutual suspicion.
Precisely. This mutual suspicion, this fear of others reneging on covenants or agreements, makes widespread cooperation basically impossible without some kind of enforcement. So conflict becomes the rational, even preemptive strategy.
And the cumulative effect of living in this state of constant fear and potential violence, that's where we get that unforgettable phrase, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
That phrase just perfectly captures the utter misery of the state of nature. The sources imply the consequences are devastating. There's no incentive for industry, for agriculture, navigation, building, arts, or letters because the fruit thereof is uncertain. Why invest time and effort building something if someone stronger can just come along and take it or destroy it? You can't trust anyone enough to cooperate on complex projects.
And what about morality and property in this state? Do they exist?
According to Hobbes, they are unsecured and fundamentally absent in any meaningful sense. The sources point out that justice, that is to say, performance of covenant and giving to every man his own, is a dictate of the law of nature. But the obligation to actually obey the civil law is what makes justice effective. Without civil law, without a common power to enforce agreements and define ownership, there is no secure property and no enforced justice.
So just subjective ideas.
Right. Where individuals would inevitably differ in their visions of good and evil, morality remains subjective and unenforceable, which just leads back to conflict. Property exists only as long as you can defend it with your own strength. It's yours because you can hold on to it, basically.
Okay, so it sounds like a completely lawless, amoral free-for-all. But even in this desperate state, doesn't reason offer any way out? Aren't there any natural rules people can recognize?
Yes, this is where Hobbes introduces the laws of nature. Now, these are not laws imposed by a sovereign, but dictates of reason. They are precepts that individuals, using their capacity for calculation and foresight, their achieved reason, remember, discover, are necessary for their own preservation and well-being. They are essentially rules of prudence for escaping the state of nature.
And the most fundamental of these laws of nature, according to the sources, what's the first one?
The first and most important is that every man ought to endeavor peace as far as he has hope of obtaining it, and when he cannot obtain it, that he may seek and use all helps and advantages of war.
Two parts there.
Exactly. The first part tells you to seek peace because it's fundamentally in your best interest for survival. The second part is the residual right of nature. If peace isn't actually possible, you retain the liberty to do whatever is necessary to survive, including waging war.
And the crucial second law of nature. That seems key to actually getting peace.
It is. This law provides the mechanism. That a man be willing, when others are so too, as far forth as for peace and defense of himself, he shall think it necessary, to lay down his right to everything, and should be contented with as much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself.
Okay, so mutual disarmament, basically. Give up your right to everything, but only if others do too.
Yes, it's about reciprocity and creating space for others by limiting your own absolute freedom. You give up your unlimited right to everything, which was the source of conflict, on the condition that others do the same.
The sources also mention other laws of nature dictated by reason. Things like gratitude, complacence.
That's right. Reason also dictates precepts like avoiding ingratitude, because accepting benefits encourages others to provide them, which aids cooperation. Practicing complacence or agreeableness, accommodate himself to the rest to foster social harmony, and the necessity of submitting to arbitration by an impartial third party when disputes arise, because, well, no man is a fit arbitrator in his own cause. These are all rational steps towards building a more cooperative environment.
And it's interesting that the sources state the civil law is a part of the dictates of nature. How does that work?
This links back to his view of reason. The laws of nature are dictates of reason, telling us what we should rationally do for peace. Civil laws, when made by a legitimate sovereign, are essentially those same dictates given force and precision. The sovereign defines property rights, enforces contracts, punishes violations, basically making the rational precepts of the laws of nature effective in the real world.
But here's the paradox, right? Even with these laws of nature existing as dictates of reason, the state of nature is still a state of war. Why don't they work on their own?
Because, as we touched on earlier, without a common power to enforce them, the laws of nature oblige in conscience. You know, they're rational, but not necessarily in practice. You can't safely follow the command to endeavor peace or perform covenants if you fear others won't. The risk is simply too high. Your rational self-interest, driven by that fundamental fear of death, compels you to prioritize immediate self-defense over trusting others to follow these rational rules. So these rational rules exist, but they are essentially powerless to create peace on their own. There's no enforcement mechanism.
So if the state of nature is that bad, truly awful, and the laws of nature aren't enough on their own, how do individuals actually manage to escape it? This brings us to the social contract, finally.
Well, given the utter misery and constant danger, the powerful desire for peace and self-preservation, remember, the ultimate goals of those global maximizers, becomes the overriding motivation. Individuals rationally conclude that almost any state of order is preferable to the state of war. The sources emphasize that this rational calculation is the primary driver for seeking to leave. Even that short-sightedness account of conflict, while explaining the state of war, doesn't mean people are too stupid to see the long-term benefits of peace under a sovereign. They can see it, they just can't achieve it on their own through mutual trust.
Okay. So what is this social contract they enter into? What does it actually involve? What are they agreeing to?
The sources describe it, in essence, as individuals mutually transferring their rights, except the right to self-preservation, to a sovereign power. It's an agreement among individuals, crucially, not between individuals and the sovereign they create.
Among themselves.
Yes. They agree with each other to give up their right to govern themselves, their right to use their own strength and judgment, to protect themselves and acquire whatever they need. This pooled power, this surrendered liberty, is what creates the sovereign entity.
But the sources add a crucial nuance here. It's not always a literal historical contract everyone signs on the dotted line.
This is a really, really important point for understanding Hobbes and social contract theory in general. The sources clarify it's often a hypothetical agreement. Its purpose is not necessarily to describe a historical event, but to provide a justification for the state's legitimacy. It introduces the notion of consent not as a specific moment in time, but as a rational basis for why people should obey. As one source puts it quite forcefully, there is no literal contract in any successful social contract theory. The agreement instituting a ruler is hypothetical and yet justificational. It's basically a way of saying if you were rational and you were in the state of nature, this is the agreement you would make to get out and save yourself.
And the core concept here is tied to authorization, where subjects surrender their right to all things to the sovereign. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yes, authorization is the key mechanism for Hobbes. By surrendering their right to govern themselves, individuals essentially authorize the sovereign to act on their behalf, using their collective power. The sources explain this means obeying the sovereign's commands and, importantly, doing nothing that would undermine their enforcement power. It's sort of like appointing someone to be your representative, but with the critical difference that you give them almost unlimited power to ensure peace.
So how central is consent to this justification, even if it's hypothetical?
It's absolutely central in that hypothetical sense. The legitimacy of the state, in Hobbes's view, is derived from this hypothetical agreement, which rests entirely on the notion of consent. The sources note that Hobbes's argument for obedience is derived from a reason intrinsic to that human being's nature that the state has had no role in creating.
Meaning the reason comes from within us.
Exactly. The state isn't compelling consent through force alone. Individuals consent, hypothetically or perhaps implicitly, by choosing to live within an ordered society, because their own rational desire for self-preservation dictates it. Their consent stems from their nature and the dire circumstances of the alternative, making submission the logical choice for survival.
Right, so individuals, driven by their rational fear and desire for security, hypothetically agree to surrender their rights to a sovereign power to escape the state of nature. Now comes the part that is perhaps most associated with Hobbes and often the most criticized. His argument that this sovereign must be absolute and undivided. Why is absolute power so necessary for him?
This goes right back to his diagnosis of the problem civil war. For Hobbes, any division of sovereign authority is inherently unstable and leads directly back to civil war and the state of nature. He was utterly convinced, based on his experience, that retaining sovereign authority in its entirety was imperative to keep the Commonwealth from dissolving into civil war. The sovereign must have ultimate, unquestioned authority over all matters necessary for peace and order. Any less, and you risk it all falling apart.
And his historical context, the English Civil War, provided a powerful illustration of this point for him, right?
It absolutely did. The sources point to the English Civil War beginning precisely when Parliament challenged the king's sovereign authority, specifically by passing the Militia Ordinance. Hobbes saw the command of the military force as the ultimate mark of sovereignty.
Control the army, control the state.
Essentially, yes. By claiming this power, Parliament created a division of authority, demonstrating Hobbes's point that command of the militia makes him that hath its sovereign, and that this very division inevitably led to conflict.
So for Hobbes, there's absolutely no room for separation of powers. No checks and balances like we think of today.
That's correct. The idea of separation of powers, which became so central to later liberal thought, particularly in the U.S., is completely anathema to Hobbes. Implicit in his whole argument is that dividing power among different bodies, say legislative, executive, judicial, simply recreates the potential for conflict within the state itself. If these branches disagree, who has the final say? The resulting deadlock or internal struggle weakens the state's ability to enforce laws and suppress dissent, opening the door right back to chaos. The sovereign must be the ultimate unified decision-maker.
Okay, so what specific rights and responsibilities does this absolute sovereign hold? What can they do and what must they do?
Well, the sovereign gains the right to make and enforce civil laws, which, as we noted earlier, are basically the laws of nature given concrete form and teeth. They have the power to punish those who break the laws, the authority to settle all controversies, acting as the final judge, and crucially, command of the military and all means of coercion, the power of the sword. The sources also suggest the sovereign has a vital role in actually establishing social and even moral norms. Remember, in the state of nature, justice and injustice are subjective. The sovereign, by making civil laws, acts not only as a declarer, but also a maker of justice and injustice. They provide the public objective standard for right and wrong that didn't exist naturally.
And the sovereign's primary responsibility. the flip side of all that power.
To protect the lives and provide security for the subjects. This is the fundamental reason for the sovereign's existence and the ultimate basis for the subject's obligation to obey. If the sovereign consistently fails in this core duty, the entire justification for their rule is called into question.
Now, is the sovereign actually a party to the social contract? Do they make a promise back to the people?
This is where Hobbes's theory differs significantly from some later contractarians, like Locke. The sources implied the sovereign is created by the contract among the subjects, but the sovereign is not bound by a contract with them.
Ah, okay. That's a key distinction.
It is. The subjects authorize the sovereign, but the sovereign doesn't make promises back to them in the same contractual sense. The concept of authorization is really key here. The sources quote Hobbes saying, "He that complaineth of injury from his sovereign complaineth of that whereof he himself is author, and therefore ought not to accuse any man but himself."
Because you authorize their actions.
Exactly. By authorizing the sovereign, the subjects take responsibility for the sovereign's actions as their representative, making it logically inconsistent, in Hobbes' view, to accuse the sovereign of injustice, since injustice is defined as a violation of covenant, and the sovereign hasn't made a covenant with the subjects.
But surely there's a limit. What if the sovereign becomes a tyrant and directly threatens the subjects' lives? The sources mention subjects retain the right to self-preservation. That seems like a contradiction.
This is the crucial, perhaps paradoxical limit within Hobbes's seemingly absolute system, the self-defense right, that individuals simply cannot alienate, not even to the sovereign. It's rooted in that fundamental drive for self-preservation. The sources state unequivocally one could never willingly obey the sovereign's command to punish oneself, insofar as doing so would endanger one's self-preservation rather than preserve it. Hobbes, the sources say, must grant that each human being will surrender her punishment powers to the sovereign only insofar as doing so will not endanger her life.
So you can't logically give away the right to save your own skin.
Pretty much. This implies that subjects retain the right to resist commands that directly threaten their life. The sources note that subjects retain, by virtue of their psychological makeup, the right to decide whether or not to obey the sovereign's commands if those commands endanger them. It's a fascinating tension. The sovereign must be absolute for peace, but their authority is ultimately founded on and limited by the individual subject's unalienable right to preserve their own life.
Just briefly, Hobbes does discuss different forms of government, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy. Which does he prefer, and are there specific reasons given in the sources for that preference?
The sources note that Hobbes ultimately favors monarchy. Reasons suggested include the idea that a monarch's resolution, their will, is subject to no other inconstancy than that of human nature, unlike assemblies which can be swayed by internal factions, debates, and differing opinions, leading to inconsistency and potential paralysis.
A single ruler is more decisive.
That's the idea. The sources also mention the practical advantage of secrecy in council with a monarch, noting difficulties assemblies have receiving sensitive advice outside their own body. So a single person's will is seen as more decisive and consistent, which Hobbes values above all for maintaining order and preventing descent into chaos.
Okay, we've established the absolute sovereign, created by subjects giving up their rights for security, with that crucial self-preservation right as the ultimate limit. But what about liberty in this system? How free are people under this all-powerful entity? What does Hobbes even mean by liberty?
Well, Hobbes defines liberty in a very specific and, perhaps to us, quite limited way. The sources state his fundamental definition is simply the absence of external impediments. To be free is just to not be physically prevented from doing what you have the power and the will to do. This applies equally to, say, a river flowing downhill or a person walking down the street if there's no barrier.
So freedom from physical restraint.
Primarily, yes. The sources also connect liberty to the right of nature. They state, by the word right is anything else signified than that liberty which every man hath to make use of his natural faculties according to right reason. This right, grounded in the dictate of reason for self-preservation, implies a liberty to do whatever is necessary to stay alive. So liberty isn't just physical freedom of movement, it's also the freedom to act according to one's rational judgment for survival.
Okay, so how much liberty do subjects actually retain under an absolute sovereign? It seems like they've given away almost everything.
Well, while enormous power is ceded to the sovereign, subjects do retain liberty in areas where the law is silent. The sovereign can't regulate every single aspect of life. But more fundamentally, as we just discussed, they retain the ultimate liberty and right to self-preservation. The sources reiterate this is the core limit on the sovereign's power. The sovereign cannot legitimately command a subject to kill themselves, or to refrain from resisting an attack on their life, or to give up the means necessary to preserve their life, like food or medicine. This means subjects retain, even within the Commonwealth, the right to assess whether a sovereign's command directly threatens their life and potentially to resist if it does. It's a liberty of last resort, you might say, but a fundamental one rooted in their very nature.
So what does Hobbes' concept of liberty reveal about the inherent tension, the trade-off between freedom and security?
It highlights a really stark trade-off. The sources explicitly state that the primary motivation for forming the Commonwealth and laying down rights is, quote, to preserve a man's security in his person, in his life, and in his means for preserving his life. Liberty in the state of nature was absolute, the freedom to do absolutely anything, but it was utterly insecure, constantly under threat.
Right, freedom to starve or be killed.
Exactly. Liberty under the sovereign is constrained by law and the sovereign's will, yes, but it is secure liberty, allowing for peace, industry, and the benefits of society. The sources acknowledge that the condition of subjects is very miserable, as being obnoxious to the lusts and other irregular passions of him or them that have so unlimited a power. Hobbes doesn't deny the potential downsides.
But he thinks it's worth it.
He argues this potential misery under a sovereign is scarce sensible in respect of the miseries and horrible calamities that accompany a civil war. The cost of absolute power, the sacrifice of significant individual freedom of action, is justified by the security and peace it provides, rescuing life from being solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It's a powerful argument that security is the absolute precondition for any meaningful exercise of liberty. You need to be alive and safe first.
Beyond the political structure, Leviathan also delves extensively into the role of religion, particularly in the latter parts, books 3 and 4. How does Hobbes position religious authority relative to the sovereign? This seems crucial given the context of religious wars.
Absolutely critical for Hobbes, given how religious disputes had fueled civil conflict in England and Europe. The sources note that in Leviathan, he argues forcefully that there is no universal church with authority above the state. Instead, in each country, the king or chosen power must be the head of the church. Religious authority must be firmly subordinate to the civil sovereign.
Why is this subordination so necessary from Hobbes's perspective? Why can't church and state be separate spheres?
Primarily, it's for civil peace. The sources indicate it's essential to prevent challenges to the state's authority based on claims of a higher divine law. Claims of spiritual authority over secular power were, in his view, the most frequent pretext of sedition in Christian commonwealths. By making the sovereign the head of the church, he removes a major potential source of internal conflict and ensures religious doctrine and practice support rather than undermine the state's authority and stability. The sources also highlight his view that religion functions largely as a system of law, not a system of truth, in the sense of universally demonstrable facts. This allows the sovereign to regulate religious practice and interpretation for the sake of public order without necessarily having to adjudicate deep theological truth claims.
He also seems pretty skeptical about claims of direct divine revelation outside of reason, doesn't he?
Oh, very much so. The sources note his skepticism about claims like divine inspiration or prophecy overriding civil law. He suggests, rather cuttingly, that claiming God spoke in a dream is no more than to say he dreamed that God spake to him, which is not a forced-win belief from any man that knows dreams are for the most part natural.
So dreams aren't reliable divine messages.
Basically, yeah. He insists that knowing a prophet is truly sent by God requires evidence other way than that of reason, implying that reason, as interpreted and enforced by the sovereign, is the ultimate earthly arbiter, even in matters touching on religion. And to support the sovereign's religious authority, the sources mention he even used biblical interpretation himself, arguing that throughout biblical history, sovereigns held religious power. He cites examples like kings ordaining and depriving bishops, and King Solomon's actions regarding Abiathar the priest.
And there's that fascinating point about simplifying Christian faith down to one essential article.
Yes, that's a really interesting move. The sources note his argument that the only necessary article of Christian faith required for salvation is the simple belief that Jesus is the Christ. By reducing the core requirement for salvation to this single, relatively simple tenet, Hobbes potentially defangs many of the complex and divisive theological debates that had historically led to religious wars and civil unrest. This minimal requirement allows the sovereign to demand only minimal, non-disruptive religious conformity for the sake of peace, while leaving other theological matters more open.
Okay, so Hobbes builds this incredibly elaborate structure for the absolute sovereign, drawing on psychology, history, logic, even religious critique. Looking back now, what is the enduring legacy of Leviathan, and what are some of the main criticisms it has faced over the centuries?
Well, Leviathan is undeniably a foundational text of modern political philosophy for several key reasons highlighted in the sources. It's a cornerstone of social contract theory, the idea that the state's legitimacy is derived from some form of consent or rational agreement by the governed, even if hypothetical. It employs methodological naturalism, attempting to build political theory on a, let's say, scientific understanding of human nature. It focuses strongly on individual rights, particularly the fundamental right to self-preservation, as the basis for political obligation. And it frames the central challenge of politics as the problem of order. The sources also firmly place Hobbes within the tradition of political realism. His emphasis on the competitive and conflictual side of human nature and international relations, seeing states as primary actors driven by concerns for security, national interests, and the struggle for power, directly influences later realist thinkers like Hans Morgenthau. Hobbes's fundamental assumptions about power and human nature are seen as direct ancestors of modern realist international relations theory. And his materialist psychology also influenced later thought, seen by some as an ancestor of physicalism in the philosophy of mind.
How does he compare or contrast with later, perhaps more palatable social contract thinkers like Locke or Rousseau? They also talk about contracts, but seem to reach different conclusions.
They certainly do. The sources note both contrasts and some surprising overlaps. For instance, Hobbes's concept of authorization, where subjects empower the sovereign by yielding their rights, can, in some interpretations, sound decidedly Lockean, particularly if you interpret it as the sovereign being the subject's instrument holding power that the people entrust to him. The sources also discuss what they call Hobbes's own fallback position. This is the interpretation where the ruler-subject relationship looks more like an agency relationship, precisely because subjects retain that unalienable self-defense right. The sources observe, kind of wryly, it is no wonder that many people have been confused by the way in which the notorious Hobbes frequently sounds like Locke in Leviathan, because this retained right makes the relationship seem conditional on the sovereign actually protecting life.
Right, that sounds much less absolute.
It does. However, the major contrast highlighted is definitely on the issue of rebellion. Hobbes's explicit main argument is really designed to preclude rebellion in all circumstances, arguing that even the worst sovereign is better than the chaos of civil war. Locke's position, on the other hand, and interestingly, the logic of Hobbes's own fallback position, paradoxically embraces the idea that rebellion is appropriate in certain circumstances, specifically when the ruler violates the fundamental trust or threatens the people's basic rights, like life or property, for Locke.
Now, the sources also mention later contractarian thinkers like Kant and Rawls briefly. How do they fit in?
Yes, thinkers like Kant and Rawls build on the contractarian tradition, but often shift the focus more towards defining justice based on principles that rational individuals could hypothetically agree to under fair conditions. The sources suggest this idea of finding a basis for agreement among subjects is actually already implicit in the Hobbesian fallback position, where the legitimacy might depend on subjects implicitly agreeing on certain standards for judging whether the ruler is fulfilling their basic obligation of providing security.
So what enduring questions does Leviathan force us to confront today, and what are the main critiques still leveled against his core arguments?
Leviathan really challenges us with the most fundamental questions about the nature of power, the role of government, and the balance between freedom and security. It forces us to consider the price of order and the potential dangers of unchecked power, even if that power is intended for our own good. Criticisms discussed in the sources often challenge the validity of his argument for absolute sovereignty. Even if one accepts his rather bleak premises about human nature or the horrors of the state of nature, critics question whether absolute power is the only, or indeed the best, solution. That tension created by the retained self-defense right is a key point of criticism. Does it fundamentally undermine the sovereign's supposedly absolute power? Does it create a contradiction?
And the worry about judging the sovereign.
Exactly. The sources also raise the criticism that an agency commonwealth, where subjects retain the right to judge the sovereign's performance based on their individual self-preservation, might be inherently unstable and doomed to fail. Why? Because individual judgments will inevitably conflict, leading potentially right back to the very state of conflict Hobbes sought to avoid. Who decides if the sovereign has failed? Everyone might have a different answer. However, it's interesting, the sources also suggest that even this potentially unstable agency commonwealth, or fallback position, might achieve stability if subjects can somehow develop conventions or implicitly agree on shared standards for judging their ruler's performance. This hints at the possibility of order emerging through shared understanding and norms, not just through absolute force.
And how do these centuries-old ideas connect, if at all, to the structure of modern states, particularly democratic ones? It seems like a huge leap from Hobbes' absolute sovereign.
The sources propose a really fascinating link, actually. Modern democratic states, with their emphasis on things like voting rights and the legal ability to change rulers peacefully, can be seen as reflecting the idea present in the contractarian tradition, including Hobbes' own nuances, that rulers are hired by the people for reasons. Democratic systems, in a way, attempt to incorporate the metapolitical role that people inevitably have on the social contract view, that ultimate judgment of whether the ruler is serving their purpose, into the legal system itself. Instead of resistance or rebellion being the only recourse when a ruler fails, as it might be implicitly in Hobbes, democratic mechanisms like voting provide a legal and hopefully less violent way to change the ruler. This arguably makes the system more stable and responsive to the people's fundamental interests in security and well-being, trying to solve the problem Hobbes identified but with different tools.
So we've traced a journey through Hobbes's powerful, if sometimes disturbing thought, from the chaos of his time to his mechanistic view of self-interested, fearful humans, the resulting terrifying state of nature, the rational escape through a hypothetical social contract that creates an absolute sovereign, and that stark trade-off between security and liberty. We've also touched on his views on religion and the enduring questions and criticisms his work continues to inspire.
Leviathan remains profoundly relevant because it confronts us with the most fundamental questions of political life, questions we still wrestle with. It's a powerful, if maybe uncomfortable, analysis of the constant tension between individual desires, individual liberty, and the collective need for order and security. It reminds us that the peace and stability we often take for granted are, from Hobbes's perspective at least, not natural states, but are artificial constructs, perhaps precarious achievements that require a powerful state to maintain. It forces us to ask, what are the minimal conditions for a functioning society, and what price are we, or should we be, willing to pay for peace?
And that leaves us with a thought to carry forward. If, as Hobbes suggests, the ultimate foundation of political authority lies in the people's rational fear and their deep desire for security, to what extent are modern governments still justified primarily by their ability to protect us from chaos, both internal and external? And does our implicit consent for order, our participation in the system, mean that we are always, in some profound sense, the authors of the sovereign's power, even when we disagree with its actions? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan.